Hello, everyone, and all potential viewers. I'm just going to commit to a small talk today about memory, the basics of it. As a disclaimer, I'm not an expert on memory. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I'm working towards a master's degree in informatics and health informatics. So, if you want a more concrete or conclusive assessment of some of these things, you're probably better off consulting with actual professionals within cognitive science or psychology or otherwise. I'm just trying to bridge the knowledge that I have with other sources and repackaging it into something that I can present. So, the basics of memory, as I've kind of chunked it out here, is what is memory? How do we remember? And how do we forget? So, in describing memory, it's important to understand that it has quite an interesting history in terms of how it has been depicted. It seems to have historically been our kind of natural proclivity to view it with this kind of abstract and ephemeral quality, but we know that it's a physical process in the brain. It also is often described in analogies and with metaphors because, people have a tendency to view a memory as a sort of fixed snapshot of events or as a video recording, but it's very malleable. It's not exactly as concrete as some might believe, but I've sort of framed it here as our ability to hold the information and context of something we have experienced or learned through encoding and to later recall or retrieve that information. It is largely described as an emergent process of the brain and nervous system, which is just another way of referring to complex brain activity. So our memory, our general conscious awareness are usually depicted as emergent properties. Lots of neurons functioning in tandem to produce more dynamic processes that are kind of greater than the sum of their parts. So the basic memory process is in 3 steps: encoding, retention, and retrieval. Encoding is the first step. It is converting sensory input into stored memory. Retention follows this. It is the maintaining of a stored memory. So if you are holding on to knowledge for a period of time, you're retaining that knowledge, which is the retention phase. And then when it comes time for you to recall or retrieve that information, you are then within the retrieval stage, which is recalling or reactivating a stored memory. And there are 2 major facets of memory to consider: explicit memory, which is conscious and effortful recollection of events or experiences or world knowledge, facts about the world. Essentially, you're consciously aware of what you are trying to recall. Implicit memory relates more so to unconscious and automatic processes like priming, skill acquisition and usage, and other such things. These are generally you can maybe think of them as being more autonomous. They're not something you're actively thinking about. Like, consider the mere exposure effect, which is sort of a preference for something based on a prior exposure to a given something. So maybe you could have been shown an ad, and as a result of that ad, you then have a preference for something that's similar to it, but you aren't aware of that. So, in making memory stronger, we might think of memory consolidation. When a lasting memory is formed, or making encoded information more permanent. So you might think of not only encoding information, but how do you make that encoded information last, which is very important. When we think of memory, we oftentimes think of something that persists over time, that we can actually use and access. Otherwise, it just tends to fade into oblivion and become rather unusable. So retrieval cues can improve the chances of recalling information by acting as reminders of the original encoding context. Or in other words, what helps us to remember something. So the retention curve is how something is remembered over time. You can see at the bottom a graph that just depicts essentially what is the forgetting curve, and it's also known as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And that over time, as we are continuously exposed to the same material, we are reminded of the same material, we tend to remember more at each moment in time that we are reminded. So it just suggests that continuous exposure and spaced learning is more effective for retention. Cramming your learning all in one consolidated instance is less effective for retention. So you can see here on this graph that the reminders are spaced relatively evenly apart. It's a learning principle that really helps with ensuring that the memories that you are encoding actually persist and are usable. It's leveraged a great deal within education and teaching as well, which is why oftentimes material and learning is spaced out in a particular way so that you don't try to learn too much at once or do too much at once. The goal is to learn something, process it, re-engage, process. You don't want to do everything all at once. It's something a lot of us are likely very familiar with, procrastinating and doing everything at the last minute. I have experience with that. It's not helpful. Usually it isn't. So the Hebbian learning rule is a pretty foundational learning principle relating to neural connections and memorization. If you've ever heard of the phrase neurons that fire together, wire together, then you should consider that the more the information is accessed, the more likely those neurons relating to that specific memory will activate together or in sequence. So neuron 1 is more likely to activate neuron 2. And by that, I just mean the neurons corresponding to a specific memory, also known as a memory trace or an engram trace. This is the basis of learning and memory on a synaptic level, but it also denotes synaptic changes relating to either learning or forgetting. So, in a nutshell, neurons responsible for the formation and maintenance of a memory benefit from repeated activation. So, memory can be categorized in a lot of ways. I'm not going to be going over all of the categorizations. It's simply too much. But I try to chunk things out into the basic overarching categories. So working memory is our temporary storage and manipulation of information. The element of manipulation is the key here because it is information that not only we are able to access but can use, which is important in a day-to-day context. So the capacity is limited, and generally it's about 7 plus or minus 2 items that we can actively manipulate at a given point in time before we start running into issues with memorization. This is known as Miller's Law. The duration is seconds to minutes, as I'm sure you've experienced with working memory. The information we can access and manipulate isn't always sustained for a long period of time, but the general function is that it is used for the active processing of information for tasks. Long-term memory and short-term memory are often described together, but I'll start with long-term. It's a more permanent storage of information with, I suppose, a potentially unlimited capacity. If we're thinking about how much the brain can actually store, I believe the theoretical amount of how much our brains can hold at a sort of upper limit was 2.5 petabytes, which equates to 2.5 million gigabytes. So it may as well be unlimited if you're considering that. But the duration could be a short period of time to a lifetime. It really just depends on what's being remembered and what context is being remembered and your overall, memory functionality. It can vary from person to person. The general function is storing knowledge, experience, and skills. So, of course, if we're recalling something from 10 years ago, that's clearly within our long-term memory. Short-term memory. Whoops. Short-term memory is a brief storage of information without manipulation. And the capacity is similar to long-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2 items. And unfortunately, my camera view is blocking some of this light. The duration is roughly 15 to 30 seconds. It's short access. Information you are given that you access immediately thereafter. So an example could be maybe an instructor gives you a list of 7 items and they immediately ask you to recall those 7 items. So that's kind of in short-term store. Odds are you will use it, manipulate it, and pretty quickly forget about it after. But it's passive storage for immediate recall. Our attentional resources are something that are very important to consider within memory, and some argue that our attention is collectively diminishing year by year. I suppose I agree with that. But the phonological loop is our verbal and language store, the process relating to that, from sound and verbal rehearsal. So if you're ever sort of internally repeating a phrase to yourself, you're kind of engaging in that phonological loop. Oftentimes practiced repetitious speech involves this process. Articulatory suppression, which is others talking, can impact this negatively. So if you're engaging in something that is related to sound or verbal rehearsal, and other people are talking in the background, it can suppress your ability to actually, manipulate that verbal or language-based information. So the visual spatial sketchpad is the more visual and spatial, as the name says, process. Visual imagery and space, object, and mental rotation of said objects, and the manipulation of these objects. So if you're thinking about, having like an L-shaped block, and someone might ask, what would this look if you were to mentally rotate it 90 degrees? That's kind of more so that visualization process. There's also kind of it's known as an isomorphic representation of kind of a way of determining the space between objects and an environment. The isomorphic representation means that the imagery is sort of a one-to-one parallel to a real environment. So the greater the distance between objects, the greater the mental scan time between these objects. So if you're thinking, it might take me 5 seconds to get to my fridge from my computer. But if you were to think about going from your house to your school, you may mentally process that a little bit more intensely because of the distance. So there seems to be some relation between the spatial component between what we're visualizing and the amount of time that we're processing it. So the central executive relates to stimuli inhibition, attention and focus, and regulating resources, which is a very important thing if we want to function on a day-to-day basis. So if you're talking to a friend and there's a loud plane that just comes zooming by, your central executive control which itself is largely facilitated by the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, should allow for you to direct your attentional resources to that friend that's talking and not be completely drawn to the plane that's flying overhead. So if someone has any kind of dysregulation of that executive control, they might find themselves being drawn to something completely unrelated, and it can happen. The episodic buffer more or less integrates short and long-term memory processes across these modalities. So it's kind of a way of managing it all, and it's in proximity to executive functioning. So consider having a lack of mental bandwidth in that unused information is pruned out. Only so much that can be readily accessed. So we can manipulate so much and access so much, and a lot of that is contingent upon our working memory capacity. So a bit of context within memory. Encoding specificity essentially relates to how retrieval context and encoding context, if they're matching, results in you being able to access that information more clearly or more readily. So, for example, if you learn in a classroom setting and then you take a test in a classroom setting, that's encoding specificity. The environment you're testing in is the same environment you learned in. So ideally your recall of the material should be better. Context-dependent memory relates to context at the time of recall being similar to the context during encoding, which is more or less what was just mentioned. State-dependent memory is a bit more distinct, and that relates more so to a physiological and emotional state being congruent with how that memory was formed. So perhaps if you were very happy during the encoding of a certain memory, if you're happy, you may be able to retrieve that particular memory or the memory of that particular context and that emotion or that affective context, then you would recall it more easily. So the Pollyanna principle relates to, I would say, a bit of a bias almost towards positive and pleasant information from experienced events and from information. It tends to be remembered better than negative information. So it could relate to nostalgic, leanings in the sense that maybe we're drawn to memories that just feel better and it suppresses negative memories. There's a lot of theories about memory reconstruction and memory suppression and positive versus negative emotional memory context, and there's a lot to be said about it. So the primacy effect is that we remember things better that are shown to us at the beginning of a lecture, of a film, of a movie. It just lots of different contexts. And we also remember things better towards the end. The end of a lecture, a footnote, whatever it happens to be. We don't remember so well the things that are in the middle, which I'm sure we all have experience with. This idea that we can remember very specific things about how something began and how it ended, but the details in the middle get lost. They become obscured. It's a very common experience. So it's not alarming when it happens. It's quite expected. So some brief aspects about changes in memory. So traumatic brain injuries or things like Alzheimer's can result in, of course, memory loss. A very important thing to acknowledge is that memory is not purely localized to one area of the brain. So when it is lost or compromised in some way, it's not always so straightforward. There's different components of memories relating to different areas of the brain, but you can kind of think of it as a more holistic process. It's not like this is where your memories are and every other aspect of the brain has no involvement in memory formation or retrieval. It's a bit more broad. Like a lot of processes in the brain, they are both localized and distribute it. So it's important to consider that. We, of course, tend to remember less with aging, and that's a normal process. Kind of like, as I mentioned, with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, well, it's not the same thing. It suggests that we do just gradually start to forget things over time. So, if we want to expand that over the timeline of our lives, as we age, we do remember less. That's just normal age related memory or cognitive decline. So, an encoded memory can update before reconsolidation. And what this points to is that memories become labile, which means that they're just vulnerable to updating or change based on new context or information. So this also connects to the plastic or plasticity of the brain and neurons, that, you know, neural connections can strengthen or weaken over time. So essentially, accessing a memory can actually make it vulnerable to inaccurate or extraneous information. So the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is a significant consideration within learning and forgetting. We remember less over time without repeated exposure to what was learned. So again, if you learn something and then you don't ever access it again, you're just going to forget about it. Not many people have the ability to just memorize something immediately and then just recall it for years later. Usually people like that have some sort of, high quality memory, or just they tend to have an exceptional memory. Most people will slowly forget things if they are not accessing them regularly. So in accordance to this kind of changing of neural connectivity, we might think of long-term potentiation and long-term depression. And the depression aspect here does not relate to a disorder of mood. It is just sort of a descriptor. So it's that these synaptic connections are becoming stronger or weaker, respectively. It also describes the nature of memory. And arguably, one could possibly deconstruct memory into just being these two processes, if you really want to be honest. Perhaps that's a bit reductionist, though, but I mean, it isn't exactly an incorrect way of thinking about it. So, a few little miscellaneous considerations are that for many other animals, memory has been explored through things like conditioning, like having a rodent, travel through a maze to look for a piece of cheese and seeing if it goes through a familiar path to more efficiently or more quickly reach the cheese. Or it could be explored through memory that is more fear-based, like, unfortunately, subjecting rats to things like electric shocks and seeing if they can become conditioned to avoid standing in a certain area that elicits that painful shock. So it's kind of a very basic memory process, just kind of conditioned, like us touching a hot stove and realizing that heat equals pain. So we are kind of conditioned to avoid things that look hot or feel hot because of that pain association. But because of our evolved neocortex as well as subcortical structures, we do have more complex memory processes. So autobiographical memory is one example. Of course, other evolved species don't necessarily have these more advanced cortical structures or neocortex in the same way. So their memories are, I would say, more simple, if that is a term that's appropriate. But of course, we can still rely on the basic principles of things like being conditioned for something, as I mentioned, like touching a hot surface. It's a pretty basic portrayal of learning across species. So, thanks. This is just a really brief primer on memory. There's a lot that can be said about even how memory is categorized. This is really absolutely a surface level overview, if anything. But I will leave you with a quote that I came upon about a week ago from Primo Levi. It's that human memory is a marvelous but fallacious instrument. The memories which lie within us are not carved in stone. Not only do they tend to become erased as the years go by, but often they change or even increase by incorporating extraneous features. So, if you feel you can always trust your memory, it's a good thing, but it is also okay if you feel that you can't always trust your memory because it's normal. So, with that said, I will leave you there, and hopefully I'll be able to put up more videos relating to cognitive science, which I'm primarily interested in. I find it to be a really fascinating, integrated way of viewing a lot of things about brain and behavior. So, thank you.